This time on Rad Rat Video, we're talking about the most underrated of the godfathers of street skating, Frankie Hill. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Rad Rat Video, the channel where you can learn something new about skateboarding 3 times a week. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we take a look at something in the skateboarding world and culture, from learning about tricks to learning about video games to your favorite pros and other pros you may not know that much about, like Frankie Hill. This one is thanks to Russman, who suggested it. Frankie Hill was a really big name in skateboarding. He was probably as big as Gonz or Natas in the influence he had, although he doesn't get nearly as much respect as them. He was doing the same type of stuff, but just twice as big. So he definitely deserves a lot of respect. And even if you don't know too much about his skating, he probably inspired the skater who inspired the skater who inspired the skater who is now your favorite pro. So there's definitely a lot to thank Frankie for. So let's get into his career.
Hi, my name's Frankie Hill, and I like to throw down the big, fat, ollie 1 foot.
Frankie Hill started skateboarding when he was a kid because he saw a guy do an air out of a street transition, and he realized that he couldn't get that much air on his bike. And so in the pursuit of getting more and more air, he started skateboarding. And after a while, as a teenager, he got sponsored by Dogtown. He started doing some small contests here or there, but his real goal was to get on Powell. And after begging for about 6 months, they finally let him on. And this is when his career really took off. You can start to see some of his video parts from back in the Powell days. And some of these videos are kind of a joke if you watch them now, from the effects that they would do and the sound effects and all that kind of stuff. Like, look at this board slide. Frankie says he never actually landed that, but the way that they cut it, and they did some Hollywood magic to it, and it makes it look like something that he did actually roll away from. It's kind of funny. You would never see a skate video like that these days, but that's just what Powell videos were like at the time. If you haven't seen any, I would definitely recommend going back and checking them out. You'll notice that a lot of the skaters in their whole video parts, they're wearing the same clothes. Like, they try to make it look like it was all one session. Sometimes it was actually just one session. So it's really hard to imagine a video like that coming out these days, but that's just how it was at the time. And Frankie's video parts were so good that he was actually the first skater to go pro from video parts alone. I was getting a lot of fan mail because of my parts in Ban This and Public Domain, and I'd write back and ask them to send their next letter to George Powell and ask him to turn me pro. Whether those letters actually helped or not, we don't really know, but the fact is Frankie was one of the first video part skaters ever. That might not mean much today, but back then you had to rank in competitions to turn pro. A lot of skaters have talked about that, like Kareem Campbell and Jeremy Klein. In both of my videos about them, I've talked about this. A lot of skaters have talked about how you had to get to the top level of AM before your sponsor would turn you pro. So the fact that Frankie did it without doing any of that, he was too nervous to do most contests. The fact that he did that with just video parts must mean that those video parts were crazy. So let's take a look at them and see what we find. But first, you have to remember what street skating was like in the late 80s. You see a couple of stairs here or there and a lot of no complies, but kickflips were still tough for people to do on flat for a long time. So here's Ban This, and look at these gaps. There's some huge stuff in here, especially these rails he's doing. He ollies a double set, which he said he had never seen anyone try before, and even kickflips a couple gaps. That's seriously no joke. Don't forget how big these boards were at the time. Frankie's pro model that came out later was 10 inches wide, and he had 65mm wheels that he was skating. This board was probably very similar. Imagine trying to kickflip a gap on that. You'll see a lot of grabs too, and he says this was because he couldn't keep his feet on the board, but it ended up being a very iconic part of his style. And here's his ender, a 35 set board slide. Yeah, he didn't land it, but he says he got really close. There was a video on the ETN network about Nigel Houston, and I didn't record this when I had my trial of it, but they do these little hype videos before some of their series. And it was like a 30-stair rail that Nigel Houston was gonna grind, and they did this hype video about how nobody skates stuff that big, and that filmers don't even keep records of rails that big in their trick books because no one ever asked for them. And so Nigel and maybe a couple other guys are skating stuff that big these days, but this was 30 years ago and Frankie was doing it. So that's really, really impressive. But it's funny, there was actually a 30-stair rail on the other side instead of the 35, and that was the plan to do that day, but here's the story. One of the tries, it was just one of those where everything seems to work. I slid the entire thing. It was just a perfect rail slide. I fully had it. About 5 stairs from the bottom, I wasn't even sliding that fast, and I looked over at Todd and was just like, where's the camera? I jumped off at the very end and just walked out of it because I didn't want to hurt my angle. Unfortunately, when they went back with the camera to film it, that rail, the 30, was under construction and there were workers there, so he tried to do the 35 instead, and he never landed it. But I wonder what would have happened if he did actually roll away from that 30 in a video from back in the day. But the next one that came out a year later was Propaganda, and he really had to find a way to step it up from that really impressive video part. It's got some good stuff, like a 360 flip over a hip, which was still pretty new. He was doing ollies over a wheelchair ramp. Years later, everyone was doing those, but not really in 1990. He's got a much bigger kickflip mute, and he's starting to 50-50 rails instead of just board sliding them. He's even got a wheelie grind in there. But according to him, he hadn't filmed anything that remarkable yet. But there was this gap at Dos Pueblos High School where Frankie was going. Yes, he was still in high school at this point, and it was huge. Probably the biggest gap anyone had ever attempted on a skateboard. And he looked at it every single day, and he just knew that he had to do it eventually. But there was something that was really intimidating about it, with it being a grass gap. If it was stairs, he could say, okay, I've done 7, now I'm going to do 8, but with grass, it's hard to really compare it to anything else. Frankie says it was a whole different animal, and this is his story. We were filming for Propaganda and went to my high school, but I was having a bad day. I was a little hungover, but I said, I'll show you this big gap thing I always wanted to do before I graduated, but I'm not saying that I'm going to do this. I showed Todd Hastings, the Powell team manager, the gap and then walked away. I was halfway down the hallway, and he stopped me and told me to hang on, and we both sat down. He said, "This is really serious. You need to think this through. Your life will never be the same if you do this. This is serious." I'd done some stuff for the video, but Todd knew that there was nothing I'd filmed that really put a punch on my part. I have to give Todd at least 80% of the credit, maybe 90%. I have to give him a lot of the credit. Maybe I get 20% of the credit, even though I'm the one who did it. I wouldn't have done the gap if it wasn't for him. And he decided to try it. He said it was way too big to waste throwaway attempts at it, so from the first attempt he just went for it. And this is what happened. I landed the first test one, but I immediately jumped off my board and started screaming, "I'm gonna make this!" I took a little speed off on the second attempt in order to set it up better with a cleaner mute, and that's when I really felt how big it was. I released early, and both of my feet came off before I hit the pavement. That's the one on the video. I did it a third time, taking even more speed off, and it felt like an absolute cliff. I came down and totally compressed. I squatted on my board and put both hands over my head, but I couldn't even stand up and cruised along in a squatted position. They filmed it from further back, but it didn't look as big, so they never used it. This was the biggest gap ever done on a skateboard, and he did it on his second and third attempt, which is completely crazy. And this gap is still relevant today. It's still big. It might not be a video part ender anymore, but it's still really huge. And this makes me think of that quote from Isaac Newton where he said, "I may see further than most, but it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants." Supposedly that was actually an insult at his rival who was short, but the point you're supposed to get out of it is that he may have done more than anyone else, but it's because he had this foundation of other people's work. And so that's kind of how it fits in with Frankie, where he did this gap. Maybe it's not the biggest thing anymore, but the fact that he did it allowed other people to do better and build on it. Like Chris Markovic did a backside 180 down it a couple years later. But think about your favorite pro. If you were to take them back in time and they grew up in the 80s instead, would they have gotten to that point without people like Frankie leading the way? So he definitely deserves a lot of respect. But what changed for Frankie after he landed this? I did feel a little bit of a mindset change at that point, more from the San Diego guys. It didn't take long for those guys to start doing the big 50-50s down double kinks, and Sean Sheffy with all the big hammers, Jeremy Ray with the big 2-circle gap. I felt like a racehorse that was in the lead for a second, and then the guy started coming up behind you really quick. His Bulldog deck was really successful. It was one of the biggest kick noses available at the time, and you see him use it a lot in the video. He does a lot of stuff over fire hydrants with the board backwards. So that was really popular, and the board started selling. They said I was the #1 board seller in Canada for a few months. My check started at $5,000 a month. I was pretty blown away. Maybe not the hugest success story you've ever heard, but not bad for a teenager in 1990. A couple years go by and the tech era starts to come in with all the pressure flips and late flips and stuff, and that started to affect Frankie's skating. I tried to get more tech, even though that wasn't really what I had been into. I did set a goal to take some of the tech tricks to something big. That was my whole focus when that stuff came in. Occasionally I'd be able to do it. I learned those 360 double flips and did it down 6 stairs. Around that time, a lot of the newer brands were starting to come out like Blind, and Gonz and Jason Lee both wanted him to skate for them, and he probably should have, because this is what he says. But doing things differently, I think I would have taken Gonz up on the chance to skate for Blind. Skating with a Blind team back then would have been a dream come true. But instead, he stayed with Powell, and after a couple years, he left the spotlight. What happened to his career? That was at the end of 1992, right when the popsicle boards came out. So I'm riding that little popsicle board for some Trans World calendar and tried to ollie over a wall that was on 7 stairs, but I didn't have enough speed. My truck barely nicked the edge of the wall and I came down with my leg fully extended. I just knew. I screamed, "I'm done, it's over." I had to push myself on my butt, on my board. It blew everything. The cartilage, the tendons, everything went. That was the end of it. There was no question at all. Instead of taking the MRI it required, I went to a trade show and then down to Mexico. That happened right when Blind and these companies were taking over. Powell was saying that I needed to bring the attention back to the company. That's the impression I got, at least. I knew that with one leg and without surgery, it wasn't going to happen. So I eventually just quit. The video Chaos had a full part of mine, and it was all filmed with one knee. That was my going away present to skateboarding. Man, it hurt just reading that. There's nothing worse than being in the air and just knowing you're going to go down. It was absolutely brutal. So he quit Powell because he felt like he couldn't really contribute. He went to Consolidated for a while, but again, he said he felt bad taking their money if he couldn't really skate. So he just quit altogether. He stopped skating for a while. He's tried again. He was going to do a board slide on a curb and somehow blew his knee out doing that. And that's when he knew it was really over. My whole career stopped right there, 1992. My girlfriend cut me. My friends cut me. I moved in with my sister. It all ended right there for me. And like most kids who came into a lot of money really young, he didn't save a lot of it, so he didn't have that much of a cushion to fall back on. He ended up taking a job delivering brake parts. When my knee blew up, I would pray to die in my sleep every night for 2 years. The thought of not being able to push myself in skating was too much for me to handle at the time. I run on passion. When I have none left, I feel like I'm already dead. After a couple years, Frankie's mom hired a workers' comp lawyer and managed to get him $30,000 and 2 years of college paid for. But there's a lot of misconceptions about where that money came from, and a lot of anger about it too. Many people think that he sued Powell, and that's how he got the money, and maybe that's why they kind of fell out of favor, or why they didn't have enough money to compete with the other brands, and maybe that's why they crashed a little bit. I don't know why people are so upset that he sued Powell, but he actually didn't. What he did was got money from a workers' comp fund that Powell paid into. It's managed by the state. A lot of companies pay into it. Anyone who gets hurt on the job has access to that money. It wasn't coming out of Powell's pocket directly. So that was a misconception that was only cleared up years and years later. I've seen quotes about people just finding out about it when he later had a guest board on Crooked years later. So people held a grudge against him for a long time because of this, and that may be why you don't see his name come up that often. But one of the other rumors was that he sued the school where he hurt himself, but that is also not true, and that comes out of nowhere. It's like people knew that he got money from some kind of settlement and just went crazy figuring out where it came from and made it up. But it was actually from the workers' comp fund. So in time, Frankie recovered to a degree. He said he got about 70% knee mobility back, which is not great, but enough to live his life. His stepdad ran a prosthetic tooth business and said that he could join him there if he went to school for that stuff. So that's what he did. And he later got into the dental industry. But in 1999, he was also running a skate brand called Legion, but that went out of business pretty soon thereafter. The company went under. There were 3 owners, and the company was going in too many directions at once. The company went bankrupt in the end of 1999. But he did start skating for real again, but it's just because of a really unfortunate circumstance. His friend Kit Erickson died tragically in 1997, and his dad gave Frankie his board. And he kept it, and he would ride it around every now and then, but he kept getting hurt. So he would look at it every now and then. After a couple years, around 2000, he realized that Kit would want him to actually skate on this thing. And so he went out and he started riding it again. And for some reason, on this board, he wasn't getting hurt anymore. He could skate, and he was doing all right. He was getting his tricks back and everything. And so he skated that board until it was gone, when the trucks were destroyed and the deck was destroyed and everything. Around 2003, Frankie put out a video part with Revolver Skateboards. And he's going really big in this video considering all the injuries that he's went through. He said that his knee has 0 cartilage and it's basically just bone on bone. But it's really cool to see some of his old school Japan grab variations and even newer stuff like double kickflips mixed in. And look at this ollie late shove it over the rail. He worked with Unity Skateboards for a while, eventually relaunched Legion for a little bit. He actually worked with some smaller brands like Skate Crank, where he had his own pro model wax. That was kind of interesting. He was also on the Tail Devil team. You may remember the Tail Devil as the skid plate that throws sparks when you drag it on the ground. He put his name on that along with guys like Todd Falcon. And that was kind of interesting. His reputation was already not great. I wonder what effect it had of him joining these little brands like that. But in 2010, he actually had a guest board with Crooked. And then in 2012, he launched Hill Skateboards, and there's still an old Flash site floating around out there. I don't know what would happen if you tried to order from it at this point, but I wouldn't risk it. It looks like you can still get his stuff through Skate Hoarding, which is a store for wall hangers and other collectible display kind of stuff, but he has a new model in there as of 2017. But that's not all. In 2016, he actually got back on Powell as part of their Legends team. They reissued his Bulldog deck, and as of right now on Facebook, he's skating a Powell Flight deck, so take that for what it's worth. But I did try to reach out to Frankie to get clarification on his current sponsorship situations and stuff like that, but I never got an answer. I gave him about 2 weeks to answer, and I don't think he will. If he does, I will put some more information on screen right here, but that's the best I got for you right now. One thing that really impressed me about Frankie is his love of skateboarding, his resilience in coming back no matter what, dealing with all those injuries. I can't even imagine. I've had some very minor injuries, and I know how tough that can be, but I've never been a pro skateboarder. It's never been my whole life to be a skateboarder, so I can only imagine the stuff that he's gone through, and it's really impressive that he kept coming back for more. So I definitely respect that about him. If you want to learn more about Frankie, there is a long documentary made by Nate Sherwood here on YouTube. It's in 10-minute segments because that's how YouTube was at the time. He actually interviews Frankie and other pros about him to get a lot more detail about his life. So check that out if you want to learn more about him. But otherwise, here on this channel, you will keep learning more things about skateboarding. Here's a couple more examples of videos you can check out. Also, make sure you tap my logo on screen right there to subscribe. And that way you can keep learning new things about skateboarding 3 times a week. Thank you for watching.